Okay, the second part of our Food in Australia topic is about Australian native foods. So native foods are foods that would have grown in Australia and weren't actually introduced as a plant or seeds from other people who moved here. So these native foods are actually the foods that Aboriginal people relied on for their meals every day. So as you know, the Australian environment provides many native animal and plant foods. In Australia, we've got regions that are by the coast, so that can provide lots of different seafoods. We've got areas that are inland, so they provide more desert type foods, and we also have rainforests. So there's lots of different plants and animals that can grow within the environment of Australia. And the Aboriginals, they actually knew about these environments. They moved around with the seasons. They moved around, taking only the food that they needed, and then they'd move on to the next place. And they'd also leave places for food to regenerate. And you might also know from the Dreamtime that they had rules which governed how they collected and prepared foods and which animals they could and couldn't eat. You would have heard from geography and things you've learned before that the Aborigines had a nomadic lifestyle. So that word nomadic means that they moved around, they didn't have a fixed home, and moving with the seasons and hunting and gathering. So native foods today are becoming popular in Australia and around the world as people are starting to experiment with ingredients and different cooking methods. So here we have a list of native foods in Australia, and it's split up into animal foods and plant foods. If you have a look along the list, you're probably quite aware of some of these foods and you would have eaten them before, particularly those in the animal foods listing. So you would have seen kangaroo at the supermarket. You probably had turkey. You probably would have had things like barramundi, which is a fish, or lobster, or crab. So those things were all very high on the Aboriginal food list for animal foods. But then some of the other fruits and seeds and things you might not have heard before. There is macadamia there, which is one of the nuts, so you'd be quite familiar with that. But make a list of some of the other things that you don't already know. If you see in stems and leaves something called warrigal green, it's actually a type of spinach and we have it growing at school, so we'll have a look at that when I see you next. Here we have some pictures of native foods. On the left-hand side, those pods, that's actually wattle seed. So wattle, you'll know, is the bright yellow flower that blooms throughout winter. And we've got lots of wattle growing around the school. And they're actually the pods that hang from the wattle tree. And in those seeds is a flavoured powder, I guess, which are used to flavour things like damper. Underneath that, that's what the green things are, what macadamias look like before they're ripe, and then on the right hand side, that's macadamias after they're ripe and being cracked out of the shell. Another food you would have heard about is witchetty grubs. So they provide a high source of protein and fat in the Aboriginal diet. And we'll watch a little clip on the finding of witchetty grubs in class when I see you. Okay, this is just a comparison of food eaten by Aboriginals over an extended time period. So the first sort of group we've got are traditional Aboriginal hunter-gatherers, and then the next two are in the 1950s. So that is on cattle stations. That's when Aboriginal people actually had food rations. And then the second last one is some records taken from a store up in a remote area in the Kimberleys, and then the 1992 recommended healthy diet for a general population. So if you have a look, some of the main differences there, you'll see that the Aboriginal hunter-gatherer diet wasn't actually that high in meat. It probably provided 150 grams per day, which is sort of the size of a small steak. And if you look along, that proportion of meat actually increased. So when they're on the cattle station, that a high proportion of meat in their diet. Also note that fruit and vegetables were quite high in the traditional Aboriginal diet, so they've grouped those together, and that's the second bar that you can see at 600 grams per day. And then the other thing listed is cereals and flours. So So that was made from grinding things like wattle seed and other seeds. Their diet gradually got higher in meat and processed foods, and you'll notice that sugar actually started to come into in the 1950s. So whereas the traditional diet wasn't very high in sugar at all. Um, Other things to note is that the cereals and flour actually increased quite a lot as well. So the rations when they were on cattle farms they would have got their meat. Also, they would have had dried milk and cheese, which they wouldn't have had in a traditional diet. But a lot of white flour and sugar came in then. So native foods are actually really high in nutrients, including protein and calcium. So the Aboriginals weren't starving, even though they had to go and find their own food. They still were getting really important nutrients. What I've done is taken a clip of the nutrition that's in some traditional Aboriginal foods, and I've actually taken the clip of kangaroo because you know that. So if you go down to the bottom of the table and have a look, so it's kangaroo, so this is 100 grams worth of kangaroo, and you'll notice about here that the protein content in kangaroo meat is 24.2 grams, so that's in 100 grams. So that's a pretty good standard amount. You'll also notice that the fat content is 2.3, and when we have a look at how this compares to red meat, it's actually quite good as well. And other high nutrients would be potassium, which is quite unusual for meat. Not too high in salt, which is that one, a little bit of calcium, and then 6 milligrams of iron there as well. The Aboriginal people actually used a lot of their own technology to create food and shelter for their communities, and we're just going to have a little bit of a look at what they did now. So they made things like stone tools, which were just stone that had been really ground away and very sharp, and that was used to grind seed, chop wood, make tools, and prepare the animal skins. You also got boomerangs, which they used for catching small animals. Spears would have been made from various materials, and they were used for hunting and fishing, and either made from a single piece of wood or wood with a stone tip. So that was quite effective at catching their fish. They also made traps out of weaving grass or reeds and stones. So those traps would have actually helped to catch fish or small animals. The stone traps that you see on the left-hand side is how they would divert water and divert fish. Baskets and bags would also be woven, so this was a job for the women, and then they would be able to carry anything from honey, oysters, berries and things like that. Canoes were also made from bark and wood, so that enabled them to get further around, and they were actually able to then go out and fish or get further down the track to be able to have access to other foods. Aboriginal people used to cook their foods in a variety of ways, so I've just listed a few here. First one, which would have been a main technique of theirs, would have been roasting, so that would have been for cooking animals up. Slow roasting would occur by putting things in coals under the ground, and after cooking the meat, they would just eat it all up. Like you wouldn't have leftovers, obviously, with no refrigeration, so they'd only kill and cook enough to eat for the day. Another cooking method which is sometimes included with roasting is baking in ashes, and they would do that with damper. Also witchetty grubs, that's how they'd cook them, and we'll have a look at that in the video clip. And also, just as I said before, burying foods in the ashes, they would have done that. It was slow cooking, they could put it on in the morning, come back and it would be finished later. They're also able to steam in a ground oven, and this is called a cup Murray. So have a look at the right hand side. It's a picture of a pit oven, so a big hole dug, hot coals and ashes. They load in the food, and in that picture's a kangaroo. Then they were covered over with bark and soil and other things like that. They would wrap up the meat and veggies in, bark from trees, and then they'd throw it in, and that was able to steam in there or to roast as well. Just pause for a minute and have a look at these pictures here. This is another way that they used to put together the earth oven, and you'll see that they've got a fish in there amongst leaves and it's cooking away. Aboriginals also ate raw food, so they could eat the witchetty grubs raw. They have worms, obviously lots of berries and things. They did also bury a lot of the fruit because then it would improve sweetness over a few days. You could imagine some of that fruit would have been quite bitter when they picked it. They did have to have a really good knowledge of the land. They had to know which things were poisonous. So some things you can't eat raw, so they had to actually prepare them by washing them, grinding them up, or boiling them and cooking them. So what I want you to do is have a look in your pantry and fridge and see if you've got any native foods in there and try and find out what you can use them for. In class we'll be having a look at a video on some food things and we'll be discussing other Aboriginal food types.